Last June, I was able to travel to Pittsburgh for Ministry Days, which happens every year just before our General Assembly. One of the highlights of Ministry Days is the chance to hear the Berry Street essay, which is the oldest lecture series in the United States. The first Berry Street essay was delivered by William Ellery Channing in 1820 when he served the Federal Street Church in Boston. The entrance of the church was on Berry Street at the time, and so Channing invited every liberal Massachusetts minister, and since then the Berry Street Conference has convened every year, except for one during World War II. This year, the essay was delivered by my colleague, the Reverend Cecilia Kingman, and her topic was fascism. And I found the message so compelling that I decided to bring it back here to you. And I'm nervous, folks. This is a tough topic. Reverend Kingman's presentation focused on recognizing and countering fascism without our faith in the larger culture and within our faith. The lecture was over an hour long. I think it was an hour and a half. So I'm not going to be bringing the whole thing to you today. There might be a fascism part 2 sermon in our future. It just depends on whether you fire me today or no, I'm pre-fired. You can't fire me. So today I'm just going to talk about fascism in our larger culture. And just so you know, I'm pretty much going to be quoting most of her talk verbatim. So none of these ideas are mine, and I can't take credit for anything that's going to get said today, just so you know that. Reverend Kingman started by defining the term fascism. She says the standard definition of fascism is a mass political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of both the nation and a single powerful leader over the individual citizen. Reverend Kingman lifted up the work of Jason Stanley, who's the author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Stanley is a professor and scholarship of philosophy and propaganda at Yale, and he describes fascism as an ideology, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as a political method. So not all who use fascist tactics are idealistically fascist. We recognize fascists less by their beliefs than by the methods they use. And she shared Stanley's overview of 10 tactics of political fascism, which she took at times word for word from a video lecture he gave titled The 10 Tactics of Fascism, which is available on YouTube if you would like to watch it. And Stanley opens by explaining that these 10 tactics, they can't be isolated from one another. And I'm gonna walk you through these 10 tactics. That's the book in case you want to look up the YouTube. Okay, so when she went through these 10 tactics, I became more and more horrified. So it'll be interesting to see what you think. And I want to hear what you think. The first tactic is a mythic past. Fascists always present the idea that there was once a glorious past. And in politics, this is presented as the idea that we were once a great nation. And back then, when we were great, it just so happens that the dominant racial group was privileged over all others. But now that that's been taken away, not lost by our own actions, but taken away by some group designated as the other. Jason Stanley said, fascists are always telling a story about a glorious past that's been lost, and they tap into this nostalgia. And who isn't nostalgic for the past sometimes? The truth, in fact, is probably way messier and more complex. But the mythical story is always clear, it's compelling, and it's entertaining. The second tactic is propaganda. All social movements and all politicians use propaganda to persuade. Fascist propaganda, however, makes a distinction between friends and enemies. It casts the other as a threat and presents the idea that the others are fundamentally opposed to the nation. Have you heard that? Why do you hate America? Have you heard that? Tactic 3 is anti-intellectualism. Authoritarianism presents a cult of a leader. In a fascist system, the leader and only the leader sets the rules about what's true and what's false. We see the takeover of the country's media, schools, and cultural institutions to enforce what the leader says is true. Institutions that teach multiple perspectives on history always threaten the leader. Expertise is always a threat to the leader. Science, threat to the leader. If intellectuals are telling the truth, they are a threat. So, factual American history regarding the ways non-whites have been disadvantaged, totally a threat. This brings us directly to tactic number 4, the creation of a form of unreality. Authoritarianism undermines what we know to be true, but in political terms, the center of democracy is truth. You cannot function as a democratic citizen if you are being lied to, if you don't know what you're voting for, who you're voting for. Jason Stanley says, if you're going to rip the heart out of democracy, you get people used to lies. The 5th tactic of fascism is hierarchy. Hierarchy is absolutely central to fascism. It's the big lie at the center of things. White supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy, able-bodied supremacy, cis heterosexism supremacy. And these lies assign some people superiority and privileges and the benefits that go with those superiority, where the others are down somewhere here. Hierarchy goes right into victimhood. Once you've convinced people that they are justifiably higher in the hierarchy, then you can convince them that they are victims of equality. Fascists tell people that equality is victimizing them because it's making them lose their rightful place of power. Stanley says the goal is to make people feel like victims, to make them feel like they've lost something, that the thing they've lost has been taken away from them by a specific enemy, usually some minority or outgroup or some opposing nation. According to Ajaris Dixon, writing in Truth Out, quote, fascists believe that democracy has failed them and allowed the majority, whatever, to be tyrannized by communities that have no right to that power. Therefore, fascists seek to eliminate both democratic processes and marginalized communities to return to an often fictitious and glorified past where their power reigned unchecked. And I don't know if any of you have been paying attention to the gerrymandering stuff that's happening in, is it Alabama? It's horrifying and it's outrageous. And it's happening. The 7th tactic of fascism is law and order. Under fascism, the definition of law-abiding means loyal to the dominant group. Members of the dominant group, by their very nature, are considered law-abiding. Marginalized groups are seen by their very nature as not being law-abiding. And law and order has nothing to do with justice or equality. Law and order structures who is legitimate and who is not. And law and order will ultimately be enforced by violence. The fascist scholar Ruth Ben-Ghiat reminds us that the essence of fascism is violence. This is an interesting one. Tactic number 8 is sexual anxiety. In every case across different cultural and historical settings, the fascist leader will always say, your women and children are under threat. You need a strong man to protect your families. Fascists make conservatives overwhelmingly terrified of transgender rights, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people and their families. According to fascists, these targeted groups are not simply trying to peacefully live their own lives. They are trying to destroy the majority's life, and they're coming for your children. And that sounds pretty familiar. Stanley calls the ninth tactic of fascism Sodom and Gomorrah. Fascist movements typically rest on an urban-rural divide. And fascists use a toxic trope of the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in this trope, pure, hardworking, real members of the nation live in rural areas where they work hard with their hands. But when politicians talk about inner city voters or urban voters, we all know what they mean. Black and queer folks, immigrants, Jews, and other people that fascists have historically tried to control or eliminate. I don't know if any of you have heard this song, Try That in a Small Town. It's a country western song that's getting a lot of play and a lot of pushback. And I recommend you try this in a small town. Check it out and listen to it. You're going to hear all this stuff. This one's familiar, right? The 10th tactic is what Stanley, who is a child of Holocaust survivors, calls work shall make you free. I'm not going to slaughter the German, but those words were in German over the gate at Auschwitz. Fascists create this idea that minorities, immigrants, and others are lazy, that these groups need to be taught a work ethic. Social programs like Medicare or Medicaid, they're undeserved handouts. According to fascist labor unions are run by communists who are trying to make things easier for those lazy people. College students who protest conservative speakers are described as lazy, spoiled kids who need to get jobs, real jobs. The thing is, the end game in this calculation is evil. Valuing people by how they work, how hard they can work, means that the elderly, the disabled, even children can become disposable. The Nazis murdered these groups first because they believed that those who could not work had no value. Is it any wonder now that we're actually seeing the repeal of child labor laws in this time here of rising fascism? So that's Stanley's 10 tactics of fascism. I need a nice sunset to calm me down now. Yeah. It's not that each one of us makes a politician or political movement fascist, but when these elements are present in number, and especially when people are told that they are under an existential threat from the created other, that's fascism. It's plain that in the United States, we are in the midst of an orchestrated takeover by fascist political groups. The legislative attacks of the last 6 months and the civil violence where domestic extremists act to create fear in targeted groups, they're all on the rise. Remember, fascism is inherently violent, and it begins with these seemingly random actors, but those domestic terrorists are part of an overall plan. Fascist politicians use hate speech to incite seemingly random violence because a terrified population is easier to control. And a terrified population will look for scapegoats. Beloveds, we are past the point of voting the fascists out. We have entered an era of violent civil conflict. Voter organizing is no longer the fully sufficient strategy. We must work in coalitions to shape a multi-year plan for keeping fascist politics in check. The ideas of fascism have been activated in this time of great anxiety about global immigration patterns, technological changes, demographic trends, pandemic, climate disaster, and wars. Amid all this anxiety, people look for simple answers. And fascist politicians supply these answers all too readily, usually by scapegoating. So let's return to the idea of this glorious past. In this mythology, the nation has become degenerate because it has fallen away from certain hierarchies, particularly racial or gender hierarchies. And the only way to restore the nation to its greatness is to undergo a regeneration, a rebirth, a reclamation of those hierarchies. The goal is always the same: the maintenance of power in the hands of a dictator or group of people through the use of control and enforced conformity. Now, at this point in the talk, Reverend Kingman pulled out a couple of My Little Pony toys. Her talk was actually called Fascists and What My Little Pony Taught Me About What It I mean, it was pretty, I think that's how she got us to come. But she literally played a clip of My Little Pony and talked about My Little Pony, which is a children's show. And my kids were a little too old for it. But there was apparently a My Little Pony storyline where the little ponies went to a new land where everyone was so happy and cheerful. And they discovered the terrible secret of the controlling leader, of course. And in 12 minutes, My Little Pony solved the whole thing. We're not going to do that today, but it's still, I do encourage you to watch Reverend Kingman's entire talk. It's you can Google Berry Street essay 2023, and you can see the whole talk. But conformity, control and conformity. Conformity and control are the opposite of freedom, right? Fascists enforce conformity and control because for fascists to remain in power, they must limit all true expressions of human freedom. Freedom overthrows hierarchies. And without hierarchies, there's no way to retain the power that fascists seek. So there is a specific reason why we're seeing attacks on trans people right now. It's because under fascism, differences cannot be allowed to flourish. Because difference is a form of freedom, and freedom of human expression must be suppressed. So fascists attempt to keep everyone within this narrow role prescribed to us, and they will punish or eliminate anyone who deviates from that. It's crucial to understand this. Attacks on trans folks are an intentional opening salvo and a first target of this round of fascist organizing. In addition to hating any kind of free self-expression, fascists are always trying out their tactics on a vulnerable group. They believe, and often rightly, that other people will not act to protect the most vulnerable, especially when they identify a difference that is misunderstood and even generally reviled. Right now, fascists are gauging the public's response to their attacks on trans people, but they will not stop with our trans siblings. And the impact falls most heavily on our trans siblings who are also Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor, old, disabled. Fascists will see what the public will allow here. And they will move to control increasingly broader categories: queer people, immigrants, people of color, Indigenous folks, women, in general, great broad swaths. They intend to make all of us conform. Remember that law and order means conforming to the hierarchies or be eliminated. Fascism has an opening when things feel chaotic, when we are overwhelmed, when we are exhausted, when we are grieving, when we are angry. It gets a foothold. Think about the last 5 or 6 years. We had the lack of COVID response from the previous administration, followed by denials that COVID was real or that the vaccine was legitimate from the dear leader. This gaslighting split us into warring camps and helped undermine concepts of expertise and scientific reality. Same with the lie of the stolen election, still out there, still going strong, which resulted in a violent attack on the Capitol. Violence, and particularly mass shootings, serve a purpose: to terrorize the population and make them more fearful, and thus more eager for a strong authoritarian leader who can protect us. Reverend Kingman states that this is the real reason that extremist Republicans do not want anything to do about gun violence. They're not going to touch that. They reinforce the narrative that our society is in a state of decay when we have those mass shootings. Our society is doomed because look at all these mass shootings. Chaos, and most importantly, there's always someone to blame for this. Fascist thinking is contagious. Jason Stanley warns that fascism is a permanent temptation of humankind and that we must be continually vigilant against its resurgence. Whenever people have been taught that they have a rightful place at the top of a hierarchy, equality feels like a threat. So maybe we take a breath, because this is really heavy stuff. And what can we do? We are Unitarian Universalists who believe in freedom and equity and compassion, love, democracy, right? If we do, we have to stand up to fascists. Reverend Kingman offered these thoughts about fighting back, because when I heard this talk, I was overwhelmed. I couldn't get out of my seat. I felt like it was hopeless. But she said, first, we must insist that truth is real, that facts are facts. In your personal life, at Thanksgiving, when you talk to your friends and relatives, fact is fact. Second, we must continue to develop theologies and practices of liberation. Watch for where liberation is rising and follow it. And remember this, liberation is complete. It's not okay for just some of us to have it. No one can be left behind, not queer people, women, people of color, trans people, men, disabled people, sick people, old people, or unhoused people. Right now, people in Florida and other states are fleeing for their lives, for their children's lives. UU ministers and lay people are leaving jobs and homes right now in Florida because of fascist politics and laws. And again, we're past the point of simply telling people to get out and vote. Fascism works really fast and it spreads like a virus. We need to come together with a coordinated national response to this crisis. And we don't have to invent responses on our own. There are already groups leading the way. You may know of some. If you want to organize with other Unitarian Universalists, you can check out the Side with Love team on the Unitarian Universalist Association website. There is really solid justice work being done by Unitarian Universalist leaders there, and we can pitch in to support it. And this is how Reverend Kingman ended her presentation. It's very easy to feel frightened and overwhelmed in an upward cycle of fascism. There is much hard work ahead, but there is also joy and friendship and healing on this side, right here in the struggle. I urge you to be tenacious in your spiritual practices and your community care. Let us remember those who came before us and survived far, far worse than anything we can imagine, and that we are all held in the hands of a love that abides. We are strong. We are glorious as human beings, and we are so very beautiful and brave, and we are creating pockets of resistance and liberation that will endure. We may not see the full liberation of all beings in our lifetime, but I promise you that there are blazing moments of joy. There are glimpses of the kingdom all along this path. It starts when you say we and know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. Amen. Reverend Cecilia Kingman, ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Cecilia Kingman.